Okay. Civil War. The book opens up with a vignette about Frederick Douglass. Now, folk, don't get these confused. Probably every one of you are going to see one name or the other of these. There's Stephen Douglas and there's Frederick Douglass. Stephen Douglas was a white man who was a United States Senator, very prominent. He debated Lincoln, ran for Senate against Lincoln, and won, at least initially. But Frederick Douglass, on the other hand, was a black man. He was a runaway slave, and once he was run away for good, he went around the country making speeches for more than 20 years, and it felt like at times his work was for nothing. But when the Republicans won the election of 1860, he rejoiced. Then he realized that the Republicans were only dedicated to stopping the spread of slavery, not to eradicate it. But he realized sooner than others did that the Civil War was about slavery. We'll talk later how that when Lincoln did not make the war, and initially did not make the war a slave war, he was very disappointed. But then Lincoln wound up having to make the war a slave war, as we'll find out as we get into the lesson. All right, Lincoln was elected. The Upper South consisted of the Upper South consisted of the states up here: Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, North Carolina, Tennessee. The Lower South, the most southern states: South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas. These were the Lower South. The Lower South states left the Union first. The Upper South states were slower at doing so. Jefferson Davis was interested in adding more states to the Confederate flag. And by the way, folks, I went to Waycross over the weekend, and I had to tell them I was surprised at how many Confederate flags I saw flying. And a lot of them were very large and looked very new. Tip-top shape, like they're brand new. Georgia once had the Confederate flag on its flag, and when I was 9 years old, I remember asking my dad, I said, "Dad, why do Georgia and South Carolina still have the Confederate emblem on their flags?" And I'll never forget his answer. He said, "They're still rebellious." We were Northerners, I was living in southern Pennsylvania at the time. And, anyway, I guess when you see a person flying a Confederate flag, you can say that person is probably still rebellious. A lot of the South has not gotten over the Civil War yet. All right. Lincoln had no plan as he went to Washington. He was just hoping somehow to keep the states that were not in the Union, that had not left the Union, in the Union. And he hoped to avoid war. Now, your book states that neither Lincoln nor Davis wanted war. Davis, to me, seems to be trigger happy and eager for it. Lincoln, not as eager. Now, Fort Sumter. Here's a story about Fort Sumter, folk. Here was a fort. There were something like 26 Army forts located in the southern states that left the Union. Of those 26 forts, 24 of them, right away, their people went over to the Confederacy, and that meant they took all the guns and all the ammunition found in those forts. But Fort Sumter, which was run by a Southerner, Major Anderson, would not turn over the fort to the Confederacy. Pensacola wouldn't either. Now, in those days, they did have the telegraph, and Abraham Lincoln was informed by telegraph that Fort Sumter was running out of supplies. Lincoln decided to ignore the Pensacola and supply Fort Sumter, so he sent a ship to supply Fort Sumter, not with any military equipment, no guns, no ammunition, which Fort Sumter had not used anyway, but with food. Again, folk, with all respect to President Lincoln, these men had sworn allegiance to the United States, even though they were Southerners. Major Anderson remained, even though he was a Southerner, he remained with the Union. And he was still a soldier in the United States Army. Abraham Lincoln simply could not abandon him. Not really. So Lincoln sent a ship with food relief supplies. Alexander Stephens, who was a Georgian, later became governor of Georgia several years after the war. But Alexander Stephens he was the Vice President of the Confederacy. He asked President Davis, don't fire on Fort Sumter. President Davis fired on Fort Sumter anyway. He fired on Fort Sumter all night. In the morning, Major Anderson surrendered. The Northern people rose to their feet as one man and said, "War! The South has fired the first shots," which was true. The South fired the first shots. But the South said that you're trespassing on our territory with your troops. Under the circumstances, folk, that was hardly the case. But nevertheless, that's what the Southern people use as justification. Nobody was killed at Fort Sumter. One horse was killed. No humans. This was not the way the rest of the war was to go. The Civil War was destined to kill more troops than all of our other wars combined, including World Wars I and II. Lincoln responded by calling for 75,000 volunteers. In view of what happened, that number is really, really small compared to what he would need. Wound up 300,000 Union soldiers, at least almost 300,000 Union soldiers lost their lives. Robert Lee was sitting where he could look out across the Potomac River. He lived in Arlington, which has today been converted to a grave site. After the war, they took Arlington from him. Okay, I think all of you know already that the South lost, so I'm assuming you know that. So, anyway, when the war was over, they took his estate from him and left him impoverished. But anyway, he had a hard time deciding which side he'd take. But then when the state of Virginia left the Union, he left the Union also. He resigned his commission with the United States Army. The North wanted him. The South got him. He joined the Confederacy. Virginia left the Union. And here's the reasoning, folk. Lincoln, once he got his army to relieve Fort Sumter, his army up here to the north and assembled in Washington, they had to pass through Virginia to get to South Carolina. The state of Virginia said, you have no right to put your troops in our territory. Why not? Virginia was still in the Union. So Virginia left the Union. But 13 counties in the mountains of Virginia broke away. And they formed their own state called West Virginia. And in the Union and Confederacy both sent an army into West Virginia, with Virginia trying to get West Virginia back. The Confederate Army was defeated in West Virginia. So West Virginia remained separate in 1862. West Virginia was admitted to the Union as a free state. The mountains of West Virginia was not conducive to plantations and slave labor anyway. So West Virginia came in as a free state in 1862. Now, when West Virginia broke away from Virginia, that meant that Georgia was the largest state in the east of the Mississippi, and still is. Before that, Virginia had been the largest state east of the Mississippi. All right. Well, now, Maryland, Arkansas and North Carolina and Tennessee joined when the Union soldiers went south. All told, 11 states left the Union. But 4 slave states stayed in. These were called border states. The state of Delaware was a slave state, Maryland a slave state, Kentucky, and Missouri. These slave states stayed in the Union. They were border states. Again, Kentucky did not have a whole lot of plantations. In the case of Missouri, a lot of Germans who had been born in Germany but who are now citizens, they voted to keep Missouri in the Union. The vote was very, very close. But some people from Missouri formed guerrilla bands, and they went around Missouri shooting up people from behind rocks or whatever, like guerrilla warfare people do. One of the men who did so was Jesse James and his brother Robert. Jesse became a notorious outlaw after the Civil War, but he went through Missouri and Kentucky after the Civil War. As for Maryland, If Maryland had left the Union, the city of Washington is located right here. If Maryland left the Union, it would have meant that the city of Washington would have been inside Confederate territory. Lincoln sent troops into Maryland to intimidate the Maryland legislature, and Maryland stayed in Union. Lincoln also suspended some basic constitutional rights in the state of Maryland, including the right of habeas corpus. And again, Lincoln ruled more like a dictator than any other president ever had. He even had more authority than King George III had in this country. Kentucky people fought on both sides of the war. Now, folks, here's the story about what could have happened if Kentucky had left the Union. If you go up I-75, go through Kentucky and into Ohio, you'll notice that on the Ohio side of the Ohio River, the land is flat and level. But on the Kentucky side, there's a big hill that goes from the Ohio River almost straight up. And that would have meant that the Confederacy would have had an easy time shooting down on any Union troops that tried to cross the Ohio River. Of course, you might say, well, they could have crossed here in West Virginia, which is true. But as it was, Kentucky staying in Union meant that the Union controlled all of the Ohio River. And the Confederacy, if Kentucky had left the Union, I mean, who knows, it might have made a big difference in the outcome of the war. The people in Kentucky, though, fought on both sides. The South blamed the North. The North said the South were traitors. The South knew that they did not equal the North in numbers or in money, but they believed they had advantages that would help them win. All right, why did they fight? In one word, folk, try as you might the issue of slavery. Now, I know I'm in the South right now, and if any of you want to disagree, you can. Because for many years the Southern people tried to deny that they had fought to keep slavery. They were somewhat ashamed of it. Nevertheless, journals and diaries and newspapers that were printed right during the time between 1861 and 1865 show that on both sides, the Northern soldier mostly fought to free the slaves. The Southern soldiers fought to keep slaves. They believed that blacks were dangerous and inferior. So they fought to keep. They also claimed they were trying to preserve the superior Southern civilization. However, there was no Southern civilization minus slavery. Without slavery, the South was just like anywhere else. But with slavery, the Southern civilization was distinct, but I can't call it superior. It was a country civilization with almost no industrialization. The Southerners compared themselves to 1776 and used Thomas Jefferson as a model, and for many generations thereafter, Thomas Jefferson's popularity declined. It finally rose up, and Thomas Jefferson's statue is included at Mount Rushmore, along with Washington and Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt. So, for many generations, Jefferson declined because Jefferson had said that when a government does not meet the needs of the people, it's the right of the people to abolish or alter it or to leave. And Jefferson had championed leaving Great Britain, leaving the British Empire, and the Southern people used him as an excuse to leave the United States. Northerners said the United States government is the best government on earth, and the Southern people were wrecking it. North, again, greater population of folk. If there's any one reason why the North won, they simply had more people. Sam Houston told them at the start of the war, Sam Houston was a Northerner who was governor of Texas. When Texas left the Union, Sam Houston resigned. I don't believe in secession, so he resigned from governor. But he told them as they started fighting, he said, you Southern people are better soldiers than the North, but they'll win because they won't quit fighting and they outnumber you, and they will wear you down until your numbers get so thin you can no longer fight. Those words are remembered because they proved to be so true. But as for Sam Houston himself, he died in 1863 without seeing the North and South united again. Foreigners across the ocean believed the South would win. Well, a lot of them did. They said the South was too large to be conquered. The South was going to fight defensively and at home. And they said, we'll win when the North becomes tired of fighting, just like we beat the British when the British got tired of fighting and the British Parliament would not support the King of England anymore, would not support George III, so George III had to quit fighting because he had no support. They said, when we have worn you people out, we'll win. You'll quit fighting. Lincoln, to try to win the war quickly, he sent his ships to blockade the Confederacy. And this is thousands of miles, but the blockade worked, not at first, but the blockade became more and more and more effective as the Union were able to put more and more ships into this area here, and they were able to keep foreign shipping from going in and out. Now, at first, the blockade was broken a lot. Foreign ships would go into the Confederate ports and leave because there weren't enough Union ships to catch them. But after a while, these blockade ships would go up and down. They wouldn't stay still. They'd go up and down. They were constantly on the move, and they wound up catching enough blockade runners eventually that the blockade became unprofitable. If the blockaders were foreigners, they'd send them home. If they were Confederates, they would capture them and would try to and take them prisoner. The United States did not want to provoke a war with a foreign country. Well, President Davis decided to stop exporting cotton. He hoped to force Britain and France to his side. He said those nations, Britain and France, cannot do without cotton. When they see that we're not sending them cotton, they'll join with us and fight with us and we'll win. Proved to be an illusion. Great Britain and France began to learn that cotton could be grown in Morocco, cotton could be grown in India, cotton could be grown throughout much of North Africa, including Egypt. These places started growing cotton, and Britain and France bought their cotton from there. Now, however, I must state, and this is something your book doesn't state, since Great Britain owned Canada anyway, Great Britain did send an army into Canada. In the meantime, France took over Mexico and put their dictator on the head of the Mexican government, Maximilian by name. And Maximilian was to rule Mexico for several years. Eventually the Mexican people rose up and they shot Maximilian and his wife. But France then had an army in Mexico. Great Britain had an army here in Canada. And it looked like for a while that they would join the war on the side of the Confederacy. But then Russia moved in. Russia at this time owned Alaska. They camped off the coast of California. I mean, camped is not the right word to use, but they anchored off the coast of California, and they told Britain and France, if you go to war, we're going to go to war on the side of the North. So the whole war looked like it would escalate into a world war, which it did not. It looked like Jefferson Davis was a better man to lead the country than Lincoln was. Davis had served in the military. He'd been in the Mexican War. He'd been an officer. He'd also been in the Congress more than Lincoln had. Lincoln had only been in the National Guard or the militia, but Lincoln learned quickly. The Confederate soldiers, initially they had no weapons, they had no uniforms, and a lot of Confederate soldiers, all right, they were supposed to wear gray. You might have heard, the South wore gray, the North wore blue, and to this day at the end of the football season, the blue and gray will meet and have the blue-gray game, blue being colleges in the North and gray colleges in the South, and they play the blue-gray game. But that's another story. Anyway, but a lot of Southerners had to wear blue simply because they could not find a gray shirt among their few shirts that they had. Now, when the war broke out, Secretary of Treasury Chase wanted to be president himself. Lincoln, it has been said, he picked his cabinet based on their known abilities, and not one member of his cabinet was his friends. In fact, as far as we know, not a member of his cabinet even liked him. Seward told Lincoln, Mr. Lincoln, let me take over. You can still be president. You'll be a figurehead. I'll actually run the country. Lincoln refused to do that. I mean, Seward was the man whom Lincoln had defeated for the nomination of the party. Seward wanted to control him. The South knew it didn't have a navy, so it depended on its army. That's why the blockade became so effective. The Southerners didn't have enough ships, nor the means to build them. The Confederates tried to build factories really fast, throw up factories to meet the needs of their army. Both sides were taxed heavily. The Union could afford to pay the taxes. By the end of the war, the Confederate Army had collapsed. Confederate money became utterly worthless. When I was in elementary school, my classmates would sometimes play with Confederate money. Of course, by that time, 1958, you know, it was worthless, and I often wondered, was it real Confederate money or just fake? But anyway, Confederate money, like I say, became worthless before the war was over. Eastern Theater and Western Theater. Here's a story about the Eastern Theater. The Eastern Theater, when Jefferson Davis was elected president, he was living in Alabama. The story goes he got this telegram and he turned really pale. His wife asked him, "What's wrong?" He said, "I have just been elected president of the Confederate States." Well, he quickly moved his capital from Alabama up here to Richmond so he could better fight to Lincoln here in Washington. So Washington and Richmond are 100 miles apart, and most of the battles on the Eastern Front occurred right here between Washington and Richmond, or at least close there too. The Western Front was much more scattered. The South kept winning battle after battle in the Eastern Front, at least initially. In the Western Front, the South started out losing and stayed losing. So the Western Front proved to be more decisive as far as the outcome of the war goes. Lincoln went from general to general for the army in the East, called the Army of the Potomac. That was not true in the West. In the West, Lincoln's generals did really well. But in the East, he first started with General McDowell. McDowell lost at Bull Run. Lincoln replaced him. He put George McClellan. I've got to elaborate on him. I mean, one of my great-grandfathers was named George McClellan after George McClellan at that time. And I found my daughter reading a book for her home school project about George McClellan. And so I talked to her about him. George McClellan, it looked like he was the ideal man to lead the army. When he first took over the army, he noticed the army was a bunch of ragtag, and he said, "All right, folk, we're going to have to get organized. I want to see every tent located within your company and every tent lined up in a straight line. And I want to see everybody in their place and at place for everything and everything in its place." This he should have done. His men respected him for it. He organized the army, and this even his critics will give him credit for. But, okay, McClellan. He was a good man morally, never swore, never smoked, never drank, never cheated on his wife. But I've got to say, folk, a man can go through life and never smoke, never drink, never swear, never cheat on his wife, and still be worse off sometimes than people who do one or more of those things. McClellan had one serious problem. He was full of himself and full of pride. He called Lincoln an idiot. He called Lincoln's cabinet a bunch of geese, and you know, geese are known for their lack of intelligence. Basically, he felt like he was intellectually superior. Well, he wouldn't move. Now, this was where he made his biggest mistake. He continually complained that he was outnumbered. Here's why he thought so. The Confederacy noticed they were being counted. So they told the troops, march in single file where they count you, then get out of sight, circle around, and then march again in single file, but try to mix yourself up. If you can, change shirts to where you look different. Then get out of sight. Every Confederate soldier marched in front of the counters 3 times. They figured we don't march for it. So basically, the Confederacy, McClellan's men told McClellan that the Confederate army was 3 times bigger than it actually was. If that weren't enough, the Confederacy cut down some trees and pointed the trees, that shaped the trees into cannon, and pointed the trees at McClellan's army and McClellan thought the Confederacy had a lot more artillery. And if you visit the battlefield site today, you will still see trees there that have been preserved and are still pointed where the Union Army was. And McClellan complained, "I don't have the men I need. I don't have the ammunition I need." When the war was over, McClellan learned that he actually had a much bigger army and he had more equipment. He felt so embarrassed, he went to Europe for 10 years and came back after 10 years hoping the country would forget. 170 years later, folk, we still haven't forgotten. If McClellan would have moved, the war would have been over. The Confederacy was not ready to fight. But while McClellan waited, the Confederacy built up strength. McClellan finally did move, but the Confederate Army under General Joseph Johnston hit him hard. Unfortunately, Johnston was wounded, so Lee took command, and he named his army the Army of Northern Virginia. The Union Army was called the Army of the Potomac. Lee attacked, McClellan retreated, casualties were higher on both sides. This was a battle of 7 days, and it goes down as a Confederate victory. McClellan was replaced by Pope. Pope bumped into them at Bull Run. I mean, they'd already fought one battle at Bull Run. Well, Pope was on his way to Richmond when he met the Confederacy at the second battle of Bull Run, and Pope was soundly defeated. Well, Lincoln went back to McClellan again for the second time. McClellan was placed in command. Lee decided, hey, the South is just being torn up terribly. I'm going to go into Maryland. He's thought, you know, if I could conquer Maryland and isolate Washington, so he picked his best troops and marched into Maryland. They were singing My Maryland, which if you know anything about these state songs, it's the same tune as Oh Christmas Tree, Oh Christmas Tree. No, I'm not going to sing it. But anyway, they're singing My Maryland. They marched, and for one time in his life, General McClellan actually moved. Here's a story about why. Some Confederate officer pulled something out of his shirt pocket one day. Might have been a cigarette, but he would pull something out of his shirt pocket, and he walked away. A few hours later, a Union private came along and saw a paper on the ground, stooped down, picked up the paper, and, this looks important. I better take this to my captain, which he did, which he was supposed to do. He took the paper. The paper contained all of the Confederate battle plan, where they were going to be and what they were going to do. The captain took the paper to General McClellan himself, and McClellan, oh, hey, I'd better move. And for once in his life, McClellan actually got up and moved, which was something that surprised Lee. I mean, Lee and McClellan had known each other in the Mexican War. I mean, they had known each other. Surprised Lee, and Lee would wonder, why did McClellan suddenly move? Anyway, Lee and McClellan met at the Battle of Antietam. The Confederates sometimes call these battles with different names. So the Confederates called it the Battle of Sharpsburg. The Union called it Antietam. The result was the Confederacy had to retreat. This was the first time that the Confederacy, at least the Army of Virginia, had suffered any kind of a retreat. Now, here's a story, though, of how McClellan acted during the Battle of Antietam. He wrote to his wife, "Oh, my men are suffering terribly. You can hear the groans, you can hear the screaming, you hear the crying. My army is being decimated." What he didn't know was how much damage his men were doing to the Confederate army. The Confederate generals met the night after the second day of the battle, and one of the generals just broke down crying and said, "I don't know where any of my men are. I don't have a man left to fight." Their men were all scattered and disorganized, after a couple of days of fighting. And they finally decided, with Lee in charge, and Jackson was there, and General Early and some others, that we can't stay here. So they pulled back. Lincoln commended McClellan for the victory. It was a victory of sorts. McClellan was really shocked and surprised to find the Confederate army running, because he thought that his own army was damaged, but again, he did not realize how much damage he was doing to the enemy. Now, here's something that Lincoln did not understand. In those days, when a general won a battle, he almost never pursued the retreating enemy, and there was a reason for this. The battle was so terrible, every battle was so awful, that the men would oftentimes become scattered. they would not hear their commanding officer's order to move to a certain place, and they would be sitting there still shooting. Whoops, where's my troops? And they started asking around, and nobody would know. Eventually, they might find their outfit, but essentially the men would become disorganized and scattered, and they had to, of course, count the wounded, and each officer had to report the dead and wounded. And all this took time, and victorious generals did not pursue their retreating foes for this reason. But again, Lincoln could not understand this. Well, by the end of